Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is almost I don't want to blow you out with the volume here. It's a little loud, but welcome. I think this is the first of the conversation series at the Salon Fair. My name is James Zemaitis. I'm going to be your moderator and host. I am a private dealer and occasional curator of 20th century design. I have a long career. I was at Sotheby's for many years as their director of 20th century design, and I worked in the auction house world for quite some time. And then the genesis of this conversation here came out of my previous role, where I was the director of museum relations at the Gallery R & Company here in New York for nearly 10 years. And I specialized in working with museum curators of design, decorative arts, and craft across the country, in terms of representing the artists at our gallery and helping them with exhibitions at museums and hooking them up with curators. And then I also sold museums and continue to sell museums icons of 20th century design, mostly from the 1920s to the 1970s, 1980s. Last December, I held a similar conversation like this down at Design Miami Basel with 4 other museum curators from the High, from MFA Houston, from MFA Boston, and from and from Crystal Bridges. And this topic and this title, which was influenced by Glenn Adamson, proved to be, it was a really good time for everybody, and so we thought it would be wonderful to reprise that with 3 new dynamic curators and adding them to the conversation here. I'm going to introduce each of these curators over time once we get into the slide discussion and presentation, but just to briefly touch upon the museums that we have represented here today. We have the Museum of Modern Art, the home team, and the great, our national institution for sort of determining what is good design over the past 80 years. The museum that probably everybody is most familiar with in terms of collections of design. And an institution where, because everything in their collection is so incredibly important, a museum where the curators are sort of constantly fighting for actual rooms to show off their immense collection, and even over many years of different renovations and expansions, it's still a challenge. And at times you walk in, it's like the first thing you see, of course, is the great helicopter suspended. But it is my pleasure to have Paul here from MoMA, and I'm going to talk about his role in just a minute. We have the Carnegie Museum. I have often said to people that if you want to see the greatest design collection in the United States that is more on view than any other museum in the United States, that's the Carnegie. It is an encyclopedic collection of modern and contemporary design in a massive gallery space, which it's significantly more work can be seen on view right now at the Carnegie than at any institution here in New York, for example. And overall, it's certainly one of the top 10 museum collections in the country in terms of the breadth and the volume and the quality of what they collect. And then we have the Virginia Museum of Fine Art. And I'm so excited to have their curator here today, because this is a museum that has an absolutely outstanding reputation in one aspect of 20th century decorative arts, and that is Art Nouveau, Art Deco, Tiffany, Fabergé, mostly early 20th century masterpieces. And in that area, it is, I think without a doubt, the strongest collection of its type in the United States. And what we're going to hear today is about how they're starting to look at their collection from a new viewpoint and starting to focus more on post-war and contemporary design and adding layers of diversity to that collection. So, without further ado, I am going to turn the microphone and the slides over to Paul Galloway. So Paul here is the Senior Collections Specialist for the Architecture and Design Department at the Museum of Modern Art, where he coordinates the growth and management of the collection, and he oversees research through the A&D Study Center. And like Rachel Delphia here, who's going to come next, Paul is celebrating his 20th anniversary at MoMA. And during his time, he has organized exhibitions, authored and contributed to numerous publications, pioneered processes for acquiring complex works of software, coordinated ambitious conservation projects. He's run the department's loan program and shepherded the acquisition of, get this, over 6,000 objects into the museum's collection. During his time at MoMA, he has curated some really remarkable exhibitions. Most recently, that was on view in the past year for quite a long period of time, the exhibition Designer's Choice, Norman Teague Jam Sessions. And he's also co-curated exhibitions including Never Alone video games and other interactive design, and then the exhibition Automania. Paul did not take the traditional route that most design and decorative art curators do in terms of what you see across the American landscape. The Winterthur tradition, the BGC tradition, the Cooper Hewitt Parsons tradition. Paul trained as an artist. He acquired his BFA from the University of North Texas and his MFA from the University of Georgia. In his early days at MoMA, he exhibited his paintings at galleries in New York. And I'm just going to give you the title of this, but Paul actually at one point was on the cover of the New York Times art section for his painting, The Mormons of Williamsburg. I'll leave it at that. But the memorable caption, by the way, was young missionaries hitting the big city and engaging in erotic rather than evangelizing activities. This was all pre-Book of Mormon. So Paul has let me turn it over to you and after that, because I was just like, wow, I didn't know about this. And I've known Paul for quite some time over the years.
I had gone for many years thinking that the internet had memory holed that whole period of my life. But thank you, James, for resurfacing something I thought was safely buried. But it's my pleasure to be here and to talk about MoMA. It's a museum that I've poured a lot of my life into and have spent a lot of time getting to know the architecture and design collection. I've worked in it it'll be 20 years in just a few weeks. But it's a museum that is very well known, especially in New York City, as having a very robust design and collecting program. But I wanted to kind of briefly go through some of the reasons why MoMA's collection is the way it is, because it's a collection that's really strong and very deep in certain areas and is profoundly weak in other areas. We like to think of it as this great comprehensive collection, but it has its very glaring weak spots. And some of these weak spots and these blind spots are informed by our history and who founded it, who are the big personalities in this history. So I'm just going to kind of briefly go through some of this story. The collection is very diverse. It has over 20,000 objects. It includes everything from cars and a helicopter, video games, architecture drawings. We have two archives. We have the archive of Frank Lloyd Wright and the archive of Mies van der Rohe. So that's the sum total of everything that was in their offices came to MoMA. So Frank Lloyd Wright's about 200,000 objects, and Mies van der Rohe is about 30,000 objects. So it's a very diverse collection. We even have an ice cream cone in the collection, which is something
And a Post-it note.
And a Post-it note. The ice cream cone at one time in storage broke, and I had to go to Ben & Jerry's in Rockefeller Center and get a new ice cream cone. It was 50 cents. I have yet to be reimbursed for that ice cream cone. I want to change the credit line to Gift of Paul Galloway. But the exhibitions that kind of create the DNA of MoMA start in the 30s, shortly after the founding of the museum in 1929. The first one being what commonly became known as International Style, which was very much part of setting the DNA of MoMA as a kind of evangelist for modernism in the United States, trying to advocate for modern building techniques, and it introduced a lot of Americans to architects like Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, Walter Gropius, and some homegrown Americans like Frank Lloyd Wright, William Lescaz, and others like that. It was followed a few years later by machine art, very heavily influenced by an exhibition that had happened a few years before in Newark, New Jersey, where they took industrial objects out of their context, out of the middle of car engines and out of railroad components, and showed them as kind of aesthetic works of sculpture And this was really where the MoMA collection began. A lot of these objects found their way into the collection, including the ball bearing, the airplane propeller, and others like that. Both of these exhibitions were curated by the well-known curator Philip Johnson, who later had a very prominent career as an architect himself. And Philip had very particular views of modernism. He was very anti-Art Deco. He was very anti a lot of Art Nouveau in the beginning. So he was very much embracing the machine aesthetic and the industrially made and anti-craft, anti-handmade. So that kind of DNA of what Johnson gave us stuck with MoMA for a very long time, and in my mind kind of created some very big blind spots in the collection. It was followed a few years later by some very important exhibitions in the 40s and 50s, like Organic Design, which launched the careers of Charles and Ray Eames and Eero Saarinen. We have many of their original prototypes from that exhibition in the collection. And then the Good Design series of exhibitions, which created a new paradigm of museums cooperating with retail and establishments. This was a collaboration with the Merchandise Mart in Chicago, which was about the idea that this is design that you can actually buy. So this kind of division between the retail and the art and the galleries was much more fuzzy at the time. It was very much, people often say MoMA's like going to a shopping mall or an airport, and in the 40s and 50s, they were like absolutely trying to cultivate that aesthetic. They were very much in favor of that. And then just kind of a couple of other highlights of ones that have very big impacts on our collection. And one was the largest design exhibition MoMA has ever done, which was Italy, the New Domestic Landscape, curated by Emilio Ambaz, another person who started as a curator and became an architect later on. This exhibition took over the entire garden and a huge amount of the square footage of the museum. I still to this day wonder how Ambaz got the budget to do this gargantuan exhibition. And it had everything from happenings, it was a very 60s, 70s kind of moment, environments, furniture, there was a car, like a Kara Sutra, which is a kind of sex mobile. And then,
but also, not that many acquisitions came out of that exhibition, which has always been interesting.
Considering the scale of that show, it was only a small number of things. Actually, many of the objects in the show were sold to the staff at the close of the exhibition, and you can go through and see which items certain staff would buy for their apartments and for their offices. And then I just kind of want to briefly talk on our current exhibition program. MoMA in 2019 got away from the idea of departmental galleries, so there's no longer photography galleries and design galleries. Everything is integrated in together, and the permanent collection galleries on the 5th, 4th, and 2nd floor. And that allows us to do these great kind of combinations where you can see some of the hallmarks from the Frank Lloyd Wright archive, including the Broadacre City model, his megalomaniacal kind of display of what he thinks America should be. It's kind of a terrifying vision as far as I'm concerned. Partnered with some works by Edward Hopper and radio pieces by Wells Coates. So you can kind of do this much more integrated, kind of vibrant display where you can have paintings and architecture and design kind of living together. And then in the just most recent years, some exhibitions that are also shifting how we collect. There's Crafting Modernity, which was just last year, which was the first kind of big embrace of Latin American design by the museum. We'd done a big architecture exhibition in 2015. This was a kind of follow-up focusing on design.
And also with the title Crafting in there as well, also pointing at new directions.
Yeah, craft was very much a non-starter at MoMA for a very long time, with some exceptions. And then in just this last year, there's the exhibition I worked on with Norman Teague, Designer's Choice, where we invited Norman to kind of rethink MoMA's collection and to kind of see its blind spots and to reimagine it through the lens of blackness. And then Paola Antonelli, our Fearless Leaders exhibition Pirouette, which is up right now for the next 3 weeks, so you still have a little bit of time to catch this one.
And the exhibition on the left, Norman Teague's show, which involved these sort of AI generated prototypes and ideas of him responding to the collection. Is it safe to say that many of the exhibitions that you work on and other curators work on there, because the collection is so encyclopedic, well, as you said, it has its weak spots, but it's still so vast, you're always searching for ways to put that permanent collection on view. And so that shapes to some extent, many of your exhibitions.
It does, and what's great about this kind of dissolving of the boundaries between, we're no longer like the American wing over here and the European paintings wing over here. We're much more kind of collaborating. So we talk to curators in painting and sculpture that want to put fiber art in their galleries. We'll talk to drawings and prints curators that want to put posters in their in these kind of displays. There's the big surrealism room at MoMA where you can go and see Magritte's The False Mirror or Dali's Persistence of Memory has posters in that room as well, which would have never happened 20 years ago. No paintings curator would have given up valuable real estate for a lowly poster in their same gallery. But it allows for a much more kind of accurate portrayal of what modernism was, which was artists kind of working in these much more interdisciplinary fashion.
Excellent. We're going to now pass the slide over to Rachel Delphia. Rachel is the Alan G. and Jane A. Lehman Curator at the Carnegie Museum of Art and a specialist in modern and contemporary design and craft. Rachel, too, recently celebrated her 20th anniversary at the museum, and I think we've been friends for pretty much that entire time. I remember, I think, meeting you for the first time when Richard Armstrong was the director and Jason Bush held the position that you now hold. And I think the very first exhibition I saw of yours was a show that you did on George Nakashima. That was because Nakashima had such a large influence in Pittsburgh at the Carnegie and with other collections. And, an area that I've always thought, needs the big show here in the United States, and you at least, put that initial sort of like, point out there. Rachel's forthcoming projects include a solo show of the sculptor Kathleen Ryan and the group exhibition that you've been working on, Touching Truth, Crafting Presence. These are both taking place in 2027. Over the years, Rachel has done a remarkable series of monographic exhibitions on the contemporary artist Sharif Bey, on the great German ceramicist Beate Kuhn, on the American industrial designer Peter Muller-Monk, and on the Chilean contemporary designer and thinker Sebastian Errázuriz. Rachel has worked extensively with the museum's permanent collection since 2005. She was responsible for the collection installation that you see here. As I said, it's one of the great ongoing displays of 20th century design in the United States and in the world, apart from maybe places like Vitra and the V&A. It's known as Extraordinary Ordinary Things, and she is now working on what promises to be a significant print catalog of the collection, something that doesn't happen that much anymore. Rachel is a graduate of Carnegie Mellon, and then she has her master's from the classic training ground for American Dec Arts curators, Winterthur, at the University of Delaware. So, like I said, I have been to the Carnegie Museum dozens of times. It's for me one of the great road trips to make. And you start there and you head out, and then you can into Ohio and Indiana after that. And I am just constantly blown away by the scope and scale of what you have on view. You have a series of slides that you want to show here talking about the permanent collection. One of the things about Pittsburgh that I think is so great is it's this amazing city of industry. And so many of your collections at the museum reflect that history. The seminal catalog, Aluminum by Design, but there's also, the history of steel, the history of glass. It's all reflected in these slides, Rachel.
Awesome. Thanks so much, James. It's a pleasure to be here and to join Alisa and Paul on this stage. So, unlike MoMA, the Carnegie Museum of Art has a very different history. We were founded in 1895 by Andrew Carnegie as an institution dedicated to art, literature, music, and science. To this day, we share a building with the Carnegie Museum of Natural History, so you can walk not far from Extraordinary Ordinary Things, our design galleries, and see incredible gems and mineral collections, as well as dinosaurs. We also, although collecting started early on, we did not have a department for decorative arts and design until 1953. And in the early decades of that department, the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, the focus was really on building a collection of Americana. A lot of our patrons, as well as our curators, were very interested in building that kind of patrimony that they saw in East Coast museums, and which Pittsburgh had not built for itself. It was really in the 80s that our curator Philip Johnston, not to be confused with Philip Johnson, the architect, Philip acquired our first modern decorative arts object, which was a Frank Lloyd Wright weed vase, followed shortly thereafter by a beautiful chased and repoussé picture frame by the sisters Frances and Margaret MacDonald, who married Herbert McNair and James Rennie Mackintosh, but this was made before they were married, these two sisters, part of the Glasgow School, an incredible aluminum picture frame. And James pointed out for us, of course, the history that I came to of an institution that had invested heavily in aluminum histories. Alcoa was founded in Pittsburgh as the Aluminum Reduction Company in the late 19th century. And my predecessor, Sarah Nichols, did this incredible exhibition, which James and I, somewhere on the internets, there was probably a recorded Zoom that we did during the pandemic with Sarah.
The COVID era discussions, yes.
About this show. But it's also significant for me because I was a student at Carnegie Mellon when this show opened almost 30 years ago, and I went to see it, and it was when the light bulb came on, and I realized that one could do design in museums. So it's very important to me personally, but also part of our history. So I've been at the museum for 20 years. I care for a collection of about 8,000 objects, and that includes everything, I often say, that is ostensibly functional, made from the earliest recorded history to the present day. So we have incredible geographic scope, we have incredible chronological scope. That said, the vast majority of what we have always shown and had curators that specialize in is material of the last 250 years, and within that, as James said, I'm really a modern and contemporary person. So you can see in this slide some objects that were in the collection long before I started. The incredible Bibliothèque Mexique by Charlotte Perriand, a fantastic Mies van der Rohe MR20 chair. I love this example, the mate to which is in the Art Institute of Chicago because it was purchased by an American architect on her honeymoon in Berlin, and this American female architect worked for Howe and Lescaz in Philadelphia. So,
and also one of the amazing things, and trying to weave in as many kind of discussions about how curators, what's their budget, how do they go across acquiring things. One of the great hallmarks of one of Rachel's predecessors, Sarah Nichols, who organized the Aluminum by Design exhibition, was the ability to acquire things at auction and from galleries before their market value exploded, which now is a huge problem for museums today. So that Perriand bookcase, was probably the first one acquired by a museum in this country.
96.
Right, and that places it about 5 to 10 years before that becomes almost unreachable in terms of its value for museums to acquire today.
So I came into a collection with notable strengths in aluminum as a material from really its discovery in the middle of the 19th century up to the present, and that's thanks to Sarah. Also a museum that made a commitment to collecting seating furniture. So we have great depth in chairs. And so those are threads that have continued to inform how I've been able to collect and build the collection. So you see here another view of the same installation. We have so much to get through, so I'm not going to dwell too much on this image, unless, James, you really want to point something out.
Well, it's interesting because, obviously Rachel has been working on this, incredible collections catalog, which I think, might have the same impact as like Vitra's catalog in the 1990s, 101 masterpieces from Vitra's collection will. And here you have like an icon like the Eames ESU which, you know, many, many, many museums have out there. But in front of it, you have these prismatic tables that were done by Isamu Noguchi for the Alcoa Forecast program, something that only you could find in Pittsburgh.
Yeah, these descended in the Hunt family. These were done in 1957, and they're quite rare. They were basically made for an advertising campaign, so they weren't put into production. And the family says these kicked around the pool house, and before they finally came to us. But just to give you an idea, these were requested in the last 9 months by 3 different major institutions for loans.
And and you've already loaned
And
them
we've
out
already
for
and we've already
multiple
lent them to
shows
many.
as well.
Yeah, they're really a star of the collection. So this is an introductory gallery, and I think I will just say here, this is what you see when you first walk into these galleries that we reinstalled 5 years ago this summer. So this is Extraordinary Ordinary Things, and I think this is emblematic of the way that we approach the collection and the collection display, which is to say that we mix materials from across time and place. We really encourage visitors to think about what they're drawn to think about why, in the realm of functional objects like chandeliers, chaise lounges, bookcases, timekeeping devices, and tables, why there's such incredible variety, and digging into that variety to discover the priorities of makers and users and all of the wonderful stories that are behind the objects that we love as design.
I also love, of course, because, you know, the Carnegie Museum does not have the massive American wing or European decorative arts wings that you see at Art Institute of Chicago, at the Met, even someplace like Chipstone up in Milwaukee. And so here the integration of earlier, you know, pre-modern objects in the modern design collection as well.
Yeah, and I mean, I like to say, where else can you see a Grecian chaise, which is on the back left there, and that's from 1825. That descended in a Pittsburgh family, next to an incredible, unique example of Charlotte Perrion's chaise in the front, and then the Lockheed Lounge. Just the juxtaposition of those 3 objects is so much fun.
And this is the only Lockheed Lounge in a museum collection in the Western Hemisphere. And again, a classic example acquired by your predecessor for the Aluminum by Design show, when a chaise like that could be had for under 6 figures. Now, of course, it's worth millions of dollars, and thus it's completely out of reach for any museum today to acquire unless it's by a gift. So it's always sort of like one of the great moments when you walk into the Carnegie, and it's just like, I mean, it's one of those famous pieces of the 20th century at this point.
All right, I'll let you turn it over to
Yeah, and then
Alisa.
so let's pass the slides over to Alisa. Now, we're actually going to briefly look at not just one museum here, but 2 museums, because Alisa just joined the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts earlier at the beginning of 2025. Dr. Chiles is the Sidney and Frances Lewis Family Curator of Decorative Arts, 1890 to the present, at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond, a position, as you said, she just began. She oversees more than 3,100 objects, including the museum's renowned Art Nouveau, Art Deco, and Fabergé collections. An expert in the decorative arts of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, she holds a BA from Stanford, an MA from right here in New York, the Institute of Fine Arts, and a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, where you're really focusing on architecture. Dr. Chiles began her career here in New York at the Met, in the European Decorative Arts and Sculpture Department, and you joined Virginia. Let's go to the next slide here just to kind of kick off. You have this slide? Yeah, hit. There you go. Previously, you were at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where you served as Assistant Curator of European Decorative Arts and Sculpture, overseeing a large collection of objects from the 18th century to the present day. While there, Alisa worked on multiple projects to, as we see here in this first slide, recontextualize European decorative arts through a more global lens by illuminating makers' identities and tracing the origins of materials. She installed galleries and period rooms at the PMA that brought together diverse objects to foster dialogue across a range of collections and continents, such as bringing in ceramic works by the Philadelphia artist Roberto Lugo and juxtaposing them with Della Robbia reliefs from the Renaissance. And you also, of course, worked extensively with the museum's collection of post-war and contemporary design in the Collab galleries, where I was fortunate enough to see the 2024 exhibition, Take a Seat, Understanding the Modern Chair. But talk a little bit about your experiences at the PMA, and the next couple slides take us through what you achieved there before moving on to Virginia.
Okay, well, thank you, James, and hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. As James mentioned, I recently started at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, or the VMFA, as we call it, and I came from the Philadelphia Museum of Art. I was there for about 6 years, and I was based in the European Decorative Arts and Sculpture Department, and I had previously worked at the Met in their European Sculpture and Decorative Arts Department. So these collections sort of complemented each other, except in Philadelphia, it was, the collection included the decorative arts of Europe from the medieval period to the present, and then also the museum's global design collection. So my background is really in the late 19th, early 20th century moment, my academic work. And coming to Philadelphia, it was a real pleasure to be able to extend the areas in which I worked into modern contemporary design. And as James mentioned, some of my projects included reinstalling our 19th century galleries and working with our 19th century collection, but I also dabbled in the 18th century while I was there. The Philadelphia Museum of Art has an incredible series of period rooms on the 3rd floor, particularly British period rooms. One of the original directors, Fisk Kimball, in the early 20th century was an architectural historian, and he was deeply interested in creating context for the works of art in the collection, and so he was acquiring rooms from Europe as they became available. And I'm showing you here one of those rooms from Sutton Scarsdale Hall, which is an 18th century estate, which is now in ruins, and so Fisk Kimball was able to get this room for the PMA. And as James mentioned, one of my projects was basically rethinking how we presented the material in those collections, telling new narratives about globalization, about the transatlantic slave trade. And I was also really interested in adding contemporary voices. And so here you see I created a number of sort of dialogues or insertions with contemporary works. In those galleries. So this was a ceramic piece that I acquired for the collection by Zizipo Poswa, who's a South African ceramics artist based in Cape Town. The Met actually has a piece by her from this same series that the piece that you see on the screen comes from in their Afrofuturist period room. But this whole series was honoring women in her life who had helped raise her and mentor her, and it was also thinking about hair as a material. So here you see this vessel on the top has these kind of coiled loops, which are honoring the hairstyle of her cousin, Amanda, who had a kind of dreadlocked hairstyle. And here I placed it in a room which has portraits by Thomas Gainsborough, and is looking at hair and fashion in the 18th century. There's a conversation that's created about that. And I also had an opportunity to work with the Philadelphia Museum of Art's incredible design collection, which really began being developed in the 1970s. And one of my interests, we called it a global design collection, but I realized that, it really was very strong in Western European design and a little bit of Japan, but it really was not global. And so I wanted to expand and really, be truthful to be able to say that this was global. And I was focused on the African continent, and Latin America, but particularly works by Black designers and Afro-diasporic designers who I learned, are vastly underrepresented in museum collections. They have, haven't had historically as much of a presence at the big fairs, and their work, when you come to looking at global manufacturers like Knoll and Herman Miller, there are very few designers of African descent who have produced work for those firms. So that was really a focus of mine, and a number of acquisitions that I added are on view in this slide, which was one of our gallery rotations in our design gallery focused on chairs and innovation in seating design. And so you can see a few works by Norman Teague, by Mac Collins, who's a young British designer, by Jomo Tariku, and these were works that had never been on view in the PMA, and works that hadn't yet been acquired by many museums.
And then, of course,
Okay, so
you
the VMFA, so yes, I just joined earlier this year, and the VMFA is a really special museum. It was founded in 1936. It's in Richmond, Virginia, which is just about 2 hours south of DC. It is an encyclopedic collection, so there's work, a very strong African art collection, Southeast Asian, photography, American art, we have pre-Columbian art, indigenous art, and it's also very community-centered. We are free, we have free admission, we're open 365 days a year. We also are a state part of the Commonwealth of Virginia's Department of Education, so we're sort of a state agency, and our mission is really to serve not just the city of Richmond, but the entire Commonwealth of Virginia. So many of our exhibitions travel to smaller galleries and community centers throughout the state. We have an art mobile, which is basically a moving art gallery, which takes art to rural parts of the state. Our education team and our curators travel to small places across Virginia to give lectures. So our mission is really focused on Virginia, the people of Virginia, and the entire state. And one of our greatest strengths really is our decorative arts collection.
Which is staggering. I mean, absolutely staggering.
Yeah, and this really is the result of several Virginia-based collectors who gave their collections to Virginia. We have an absolutely outstanding collection of Fabergé and Russian decorative arts. This is the most significant collection of Fabergé in the United States, actually outside of Russia. We have 5 imperial Easter eggs, as well as many, many dozens of examples of the Fabergé firm's work, the enameled picture frames and smaller objects. We even have Fabergé furniture, which is extremely rare to see. And this all entered the museum because of a bequest from a woman named Lillian Thomas Pratt in 1947. And she was collecting Fabergé, was purchasing Fabergé from Armand Hammer and other dealers who were getting works from the Soviet Union in the early 20th century. Sorry, I'm going the wrong way. I don't know how to go back. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so we have this wonderful collection here in Richmond of Fabergé. We also have extraordinary collections, as James mentioned, of Art Nouveau, particularly French Art Nouveau, but we have Art Nouveau representing countries across Europe and the United States, Belgium, Italy, Spain, and an extremely wonderful collection of Tiffany material. And this also is the result of the collecting interests of a particular donor to the museum, in this case, Sidney and Francis Lewis of Richmond, Virginia. They founded and owned a store called Best Products, which sold electronics and jewelry. It was sort of a catalog, mail-in order store, which also had shop fronts or stores across the United States where you could see the merchandise. And they worked with James Wines and Robert Venturi to create very bold, progressive buildings. Each of the buildings was almost like an object itself. Some of the facades looked like they were crumbling. Others, had forests growing through them or looked like trees were growing through them. And anyway, they were initially interested in collecting 18th century English furniture, but they learned that really the best collections had already gone to private collectors and museums. This 18th century, English furniture was really the collecting taste of most Virginians at that time. And the story goes that Mr. Lewis was in New York City one day. He was in a taxi downtown, picked up the Village Voice and saw an ad by Andy Warhol that said, "We'll trade anything for art." So he called the number and he said, "Well, we have this company. I'll send you my catalog. Let me know if there's something that you would like and maybe we can trade." Andy Warhol selected the largest television set that was available, an RCA TV that was huge, and in return he did a silkscreen painting of Mrs. Lewis. And this was the beginning of a friendship and many more exchanges. Andy Warhol came to Richmond many times and stayed with the Lewises, and they actually lived with these objects in their collection. So, he was sitting on Art Nouveau, settees and Art Deco objects, but they continued, and through Andy Warhol they met other artists. This was in the 60s, and there are records of, what Roy Lichtenstein wanted, a stove or sets of dishware, just very practical things. But they began building a collection of, pop art, minimalist art, working with contemporary artists in the 1960s. And one of those artists, Theodoros Stamos, liked Art Nouveau, and he introduced them to Art Nouveau in the late 60s, and they just fell in love with it and started collecting Art Nouveau at a time when it really was not very popular. And so there were objects that were available, and there were also collections that were becoming available at auction. So in the 1970s, they really moved to get a lot of these key objects, and that's how this collection came together. And then they moved to Art Deco as well. And so the VMFA has, one of the best, if not arguably the best, collections of Art Deco in the United States, along with the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And, the kind of prized core ensemble of objects comes from Jacques Doucet's apartment in Paris, a French couturier who was really commissioning new works by some of the best Art Deco artists at the time. And here you see a bird cage by Pierre Legrand, which stood in the foyer of his apartment in Paris.
And can I just say, too, it's interesting because, recently there was Design Miami Paris, and for those of you on Instagram, it was a recent exhibition at the Decorative Arts Museum in Paris on, of their Art Deco collection. The famous Galerie Valois had this celebratory, exhibition of French Art Deco out, masterpieces by Eileen Gray, Pierre Legrand, and yet I kept thinking to myself, Virginia's better. Like, their collection is extraordinary like this, and to look at this, to see the Eileen Gray block screen. Now, MoMA also does have a block screen, to be fair, but the work here, and really at the time when this was being acquired, the Pierre Legrand bird cage went from Jacques Doucet's collection to Robin Symes, the great antiquities dealer who lived in the Philip Johnson townhouse here in New York. Sotheby's sold that in 1989. The prices being paid by the museum at that time were actually quite strong. So this wasn't even a case of being before its time the way we might see with some of the acquisitions at the Carnegie. I do think the Art Nouveau and Art Deco departments of Sotheby's and Christie's relied on Virginia at that time.
Yeah. And it's funny about that Eileen Gray block screen that you see there on the right. That actually was not built or made in the 1920s. The Lewises saw her work, and we have several examples of Eileen Gray pieces in the collection, and they reached out to her and they said, "We'd love to get one of these screens," and she said, "Well, I can make one for you." And so they went to Paris and met with her, and so that was actually made in 1973 for them, based off of their interest, but they cultivated a friendship with her as well.
That's extraordinary. And it's also, I can imagine Andy Warhol and them probably traveled to like Sotheby's Monaco and bought things together, and then his work, of course, ended up later on after he died in his single owner collection at Sotheby's.
Yeah, so these are really the strengths, but we also, they were interested in representing the decorative arts sort of more comprehensively from the late 19th and early 20th century. So we have American and British arts and crafts. I mentioned the Tiffany. We have Vienna Secession Works, Wiener Werkstätte, a little bit of Bauhaus, Le Corbusier and Charlotte Perriand. So we touch on all of this, and they actually hired a private curator named Frederick Brandt to work with them and help build their collection. And then when they donated their collection to the museum in 1985. Frederick Brandt began working for the museum, and the Lewises also, they were very engaged in Richmond and with the museum. They had been trustees. Sidney Lewis had been the chairman of the board of trustees, so they understood when you give a collection to a museum, you need to provide resources, so they gave money so that the museum could continue building the collection. And they also provided funds for the curator, for conservation, and then they worked with Paul and Bunny Mellon, who were in Virginia, to construct a whole new wing in Richmond. So there's a wing that was built in 1985, and half of it is just to present their decorative arts collection and also their fine arts collection.
Now we're going to kind of use this opportunity, because here you have an instance where you have a single powerful, patron couple really shaping an entire museum's collection. But all three of you as curators in today's environment, for the most part, you're working with committees, you're working with your museum director, you're working with existing funds to shape your collection today. And acquisitions processes differ from museum to museum, especially now that your museums are past sort of their formative years when it was shaped by like a single massive gift. The next slide. Oh, of course. But yes, I forgot about this slide, of course. Your collection, however, and this is really where you're coming in now as a new curator here, not so strong in the later material, obviously, in terms of later material, work like this in terms of postmodernism. But
yeah, so the real strengths of our collection and what we're known for is that late 19th, early 20th century moment. But to my great surprise, when I arrived and started, learning the collection and going through storage, I noticed that there were quite a few modern contemporary design objects, especially, quite a few postmodern design objects from the 1980s. And there was a credit line that said Council of Good Design Fund for a lot of these objects. So I went to our archives and started doing a little bit of digging and learned that in the 1980s, the curator at the museum, Frederick Brandt, initiated a program which was modeled after MoMA's Good Design exhibitions in the 1950s, called the Good Design Collection. And he started acquiring works that were then in production of excellent design quality. And the goal was to really build a collection of contemporary design. And in some ways this was consistent with the Lewis's collecting practices, because when they gave their Art Nouveau and Art Deco to the museum in 1985, and I don't have any slides here, but as I mentioned, they lived with these objects. So it was Art Nouveau desk and Art Deco chair, and in the background, a Warhol painting or a Frank Stella or a Claes Oldenburg. They redecorated their house with what at the time was contemporary design, 1980s design. So this is kind of in the DNA of their collecting practices, but we do have a few objects here and there, and I'm showing you this first chair from 1983 by Michele De Lucchi, but we have Sotsas in Memphis and Studio Alchemia and a number of other things. So there is sort of a blueprint for this, and it's my interest in picking up the pieces and adding to that collection.
now let's pass it back to Paul here in terms of the clicker, and we're going to kind of get into a little bit, while we can, fairly quickly, the acquisitions process and what you are each individually working on and what you see, how you're shaping the collections moving forward.
Sure. So I would preface it by saying that as wonderful as these curators are, they don't always get what they want. And this is, it's like the Stones song. This is my beloved colleague, Paola Antonelli, who's celebrated recently her 30th anniversary at the Museum of Modern Art. She's shaped our collection very strongly over the years. is renowned throughout the field for her curatorial vision. Paula is always advocating for very challenging design, and she doesn't always get what she wants, right? So sometimes she'll find, this is a piece that we acquired just last year by Sachendra Pakale. The BM horse does not stand for bowel movement, it's bell metal horse. We've had to disabuse a lot of people of that. So Paula wanted to present this, she loved it, so she thought she'd present it to our acquisition committee. And this committee is made up of patrons of the museum and scholars who come together and vote on it. So she can either get approved or denied, and denials do happen. This committee makes their opinions known, and they make their opinions known very strongly. They're writing the checks for these things, and they have a say on whether these things deserve to be added to the museum's collection. So it's a body of people that we meet with 3 to 4 times a year, and they weigh on whether curators get whether curators made a good case.
What's the next slide?
Yeah.
Go.
So these are just some 2025 acquisitions. Paula presented the work of Lani Adeoye, this wonderful walker that she made using indigenous fabrics from Africa. Chino Cinelli's Super Corsa bicycle. So our collection goes in a lot of different directions. This bicycle was partly an idea of the trustees because our recently retired director, Glenn Lowry, was an avid cyclist, so they thought we should get a bicycle in his honor. And then this lovely Paul Henningsen lamp from the 1920s came to us. We actually had one in the collection, but it was a 1990s version, and this one was actually owned by Alvar Aalto. This was an Aalto's own home, so that has spectacular provenance. So it was one that we thought we'd upgrade with. And then just a couple of interesting things that were, until very recent years, missing from MoMA's collection, like the Eames Hang-It-All, for time, and the Satsas, and then some missing masterpieces. Some of these I like including because of our sources. The Sony Walkman, the kind of prototypical famous mobile music player. We bought this on eBay. We do source and acquire things from eBay. Or the Docomo emoji, the original emoji from Japan. This came directly from the manufacturer. Or Egon Riss, this guy who was working at R & Company, called us up and said he has this amazing thing. James, did you want to?
Well, it is you know, one of your colleagues, Juliet Kinchin, the great British historical design curator, you know, was retiring. And there was, I believe, a groundswell amongst the committee in terms of what could they do to honor her. And she and her husband, who is a great art historian in his own right, Paul, had frequently called this penguin donkey a prime object because it was produced by Isacon in Britain in 1939. And the idea was to show the penguin paperback inside it, which had also just been developed. But only a handful were made because the Germans invaded Poland and cut off the plywood supply from Estonia. And this particular one came from the estate of Isacon's founder, Jack Pritchard. And for me, it was like a holy grail moment.
And we got it out in the galleries almost immediately after it came to the museum. So. Yeah. And then just kind of moving into some of the directions we're pursuing now with the Crafting Modernity show, we're trying to deepen our collections of Latin America, and in particular, revisit our engagement with craft, because being so influenced by the DNA of Philip Johnson, we were very anti-craft in many ways for a long time, but now we're trying to very thoughtfully re-embrace craft and think about that. So we've acquired multiple works by the great Mexican designer Clara Porcet. There was a fantastic exhibition at the Art Institute of Chicago recently on hers.
And of course then, passing it over to Rachel here at the Carnegie, I think one of the through lines we're seeing in national collecting by the great institutions, of course, is emphasizing Latin America and also emphasizing, of course, great women architects and designers such as
Lina Bobardi. So this is an object from 1951, and this is a really incredible example that we found at Design Miami about 3 years ago and brought into the collection in 2023. And this is quite unique in having a plaque on the back, which is uniquely numbered, and it's the only example that's ever been found with that plaque.
And
intact.
It's also an incredible wicker example as well.
It's an incredible wicker example. There's more of these have survived in fabric.
Yeah.
But
MoMA has one there.
Paul just mentioned mentioned acquisition committees, and that's something that we also have at the Carnegie for a little bit of breadth. I thought I would just briefly mention how we approach collecting, and in addition to external committees that are often also part of boards of trustees or advisory boards, we build collections plans and strategies. In 2020 and 2021, we actually did a kind of unique exercise in that all of the curators at Carnegie Museum of Art across the disciplines came together and identified some shared directions of pursuit. And one of those was really cultivating a plurality of perspectives. And so for me, within decorative arts and design and craft, that meant women designers like Lena Bobardi, who was not in our collection, or Marion Brandt, the only woman to ever lead the metal workshop at the Bauhaus with these incredible bowls from 1926, or Greta Magnuson Grossman, this incredible grasshopper lamp, or sorry, cobra lamp. The grasshopper is a different model, which has its MoMA Good Design sticker on it from the exhibition in 1950 at
Branding
the Museum
MoMA
of
in
Modern
early retail,
Art.
yeah.
So another theme for us was exploring the here and now and looking at political, social, technological, cultural issues of our time. And so one of the threads that I've interpreted for the Decorative Arts and Design collection is looking at the intersection of high technology and high craft. So this is an incredible object by Joris Laarman, the Dutch designer. This is called the Vortex console, designed using software meant to model fluid dynamics, but treating that like a graphic design tool. And then this is laser cut in aluminum and hand assembled. And another example of that, this is by Studio Drift. This is a chandelier called Fragile Future. Those are in fact silver dandelions, disassembled from the original seed heads and re-glued every seed onto an LED. Light bulb.
These are the guys, of course, that did the Central Park
yes.
installation in the sky that was somewhat panned. I think that's better. Their work is better in this format here.
Yeah. And then also this chair on the right by Tanya Aganiga, and this bench by the duo Studio Drift based in London. And then finally, just a kind of third category approach to the idea of cultivating a plurality of perspectives. It was also extending the collections in areas that already exist. So in addition to aluminum and seating furniture, I came to a museum that had great strength in studio ceramics. And so building onto that collection with incredible new work on the right by Roberto Lugo, who was represented by R & Company. Many people in this room might know his work. You may not know the work on the left, which is by David McDonald, who is an 80-year-old artist in Syracuse, New York, and very proudly interpreting the traditions as a member, the traditions of Nigerian pottery as a member of the Black diaspora.
And I don't know if you can see this, folks, because depending on what you're sitting, but of course, this Roberto Lugo vase, which is talking about the school-to-prison pipeline through, children and adults and their struggle to eat and food. The inclusion of the SNAP sign, I just happen to notice that considering what's going on right now.
Yeah, no, really, this goes from kids in the cafeteria line receiving sustenance at school to, to SNAP and food stamps, people lining up outside a bodega in Philadelphia, to finally inmates receiving food as they are incarcerated. And this relates very personally to an experience that Roberto had as a young person on a field trip to a prison in Philadelphia, and being kind of called out as an example by the warden because of his identity, as a cautionary tale of where you don't want to end up. So these are both very politically engaged objects too that we are really thrilled to add to the collection.
And when you put these works out on view, because they're not on view yet, correct?
David's is.
David's is. When you put Roberto's out, are you going to put it within your big collection galleries, or are you thinking about taking the approach that maybe Alisa did when she was at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, putting it in an antiquities wing or somewhere else within the museum?
I mean, I think it's an interesting question. David's work is on view now in Extraordinary Ordinary Things. Roberto's, we've toyed with a couple of different contexts, including new acquisitions, and it's also now been requested for his upcoming retrospective in a
true.
Midwestern
Right.
museum. So that may forestall our decision making on how to first debut it in Pittsburgh.
And then let's pass it over to Virginia for the finale here. You've just been here, but already you've been making your mark, I think, in terms of dramatically changing what people think about when they think of Virginia's collection.
Yeah, so just a few recent acquisitions in Virginia. We have a collections plan process. When you are a new curator in Virginia, you have to come up with a collections plan, present it to the board. So I did that recently, and part of my plan is to, fill in some of the gaps and add to our modern and contemporary design collection. This is one of my first acquisitions, which is a chair by Wendy Murayama, her Mickey Macintosh chair, which is drawing inspiration from the high-backed chairs of Macintosh, which we have in our collection, but of course, designed in 1981. She's looking at Disney and is sort of tapping into that postmodern way of thinking. And she actually studied in Richmond briefly, so it's a nice addition to our collection. And a number of possibilities for how we might display this in the future. And I should mention, we are now embarking on our largest construction and expansion campaign in the museum's history. So we're going to build a new 5-story building on our campus. We'll have an additional, I think, 173,000 square feet with extended galleries. And I have an opportunity to completely rethink reinstall the decorative arts galleries. So I do plan to incorporate modern and contemporary design and continue creating some of these dialogues, but also put design, hopefully collaborate with my curatorial colleagues in all areas of the collection of the museum. And then I'm very excited about these two works, and we're actually acquiring 2 additional works by Alex Locadia, who, so I should say, in addition to adding works by iconic designers of the 20th century, I'm also very interested in adding works by designers who really have yet to receive the recognition that I think they deserve, and he's definitely one of those people. He was here in New York working in the late 70s and 80s as part of the art furniture movement, Art and Industry, this gallery founded by Rick Kaufman in 1977. He was engaged with that gallery, but his work, he's so creative. He came from working in cars, customizing cars, and you see a lot of that influence in his work. He also was very interested in his African heritage and Afro-diasporic forms, and so you see the piece on the left. This is a lighting device. It's a lamp, but it's also a functional jewelry box, which he designed for his girlfriend, and it's drawing from a variety of Afro-diasporic references, Egyptian sarcophagi. In Khizi and Kandy, you can see this interior chest that has nails protruding where the jewelry was meant to hang. The top, that resin crown, has a Benin African mask embedded in it, or a form of a mask. And then it's the interior has 1980s contemporary hip-hop jewelry that he collected here in New York, the moment of the birth of hip-hop. So it's just this extraordinary object, which he had in his personal collection for 30 years because it meant so much to him. And he's created works inspired by Memphis. He also had a line of Batman-themed furniture in the late 80s and 1990s, inspired by the Tim Burton movies. And here you see a Catwoman chaise inspired by Michelle Pfeiffer's portrayal of that character. There's also a Batman chair, which we're acquiring, and which the Museum of Arts and Design here in New York has as well. There were only 2 that he made. Oh, and then I should mention, we will continue to add to this extraordinary collection of Art Nouveau and Art Deco, and so expanding the geography, so moving into Central Europe and Latvia, but also thinking about different mediums. The Lewises didn't collect ceramics as much, so this is a recent acquisition, a monumental vase by Pierre-Adrien Delperrat, one of the most important French ceramic artists of the late 19th century. I had never in person seen a a vase by him this large. It's almost 4 feet tall.
41 inches, I see. Okay,
Yeah,
wow.
so just an extraordinary example of his work, which shows his innovative glazing techniques that he was known for. But this will be a new sort of showstopper piece in the galleries when we reinstall them.
It's a reminder, of course, that museums continue to collect in traditional categories that, look, the Met just opened an exhibition on Martin Eidelberg's collection that's filled with great ceramics like that.
Yeah,
So it is
collection.
definitely something. Sort of a lightning round here. I hope you guys don't mind if we're a couple minutes over. Everyone okay? Because the next one isn't until 2 p.m., correct? Good. Okay, so we're gonna go a couple minutes over versus feeling like, oh my God, we gotta get out of here. The last slide here, which is presented by Paul of MoMA, is a quick lightning round where each of you as curators sort of hope that you can continue to acquire. We only have a visual for what MoMA has been doing, but just a quick sort of like hopes and dreams section, like what am I thinking, what could I get kind of, in the next couple of years. Paul.
Well, I included these images of works by Sheila Hicks, the super important fiber artist and sculptor who had a long-standing relationship with MoMA because she's one of those examples of an artist who wound up in a strange place. She's an artist, but fiber art and all of the artists, Magdalena Abakanowicz, Sheila Hicks, all of these are in the architecture and design collection because painting and sculpture at MoMA deemed these things not art. And that also had a strong whiff of misogyny going on as well because so many of those practitioners were women. But MoMA had been collecting and having a conversation with Sheila for a very long time. These are 2 gifts that she gave us just this last year. They were featured in the recent exhibition Woven Histories that I was very happy to work on that exhibition. And they're an example of craft finding its way into MoMA's collection despite all the efforts to keep it out. And textiles and fiber art are one of those examples. So as I was saying earlier, MoMA very strongly wants to reevaluate its relationship with craft. When it comes to things like studio art, ceramics, our collection is profoundly weak. Very, very bad. Studio craft furniture, very, very few objects in MoMA's collection because there was a very concerted effort to keep those things out. Those were not what MoMA stood for. So we're very, among ourselves, constantly talking about how do we undo this legacy, how do we responsibly and carefully move forward to kind of bring craft into MoMA in a way that makes sense.
Rachel, you've had the benefit of collecting in depth over the last 20 years in many, many categories. But as you look to the future, now that you're in the process of putting to bed the collections catalog of everything you and your predecessors have been doing, what is it that you sort of are like, oh man, I really missed this, like this is something that I'd really love to focus on in the next few years, finding for the collection.
Well, it's funny that Paul is showing the Sheila Hicks slide because I went to visit Sheila in her studio in June, which is absolutely an amazing, life-changing experience. It was an incredible privilege to be able to meet this legendary fiber artist. It's interesting. I hadn't really thought about how much craft was kept at bay, specific craft and studio craft was kept at bay at MoMA. I think at my institution, it's interesting because I'm able to work more at the intersection of decorative arts, design, craft, and contemporary art. And so whereas, you're arguing for it coming in, I'm actually, we have work by fiber artists that's in the contemporary collection. And so then, I'm actually talking to my colleagues, my curatorial colleagues in contemporary art to make sure that we're on the same page, right? So I'm not actually stepping in their territory, but rather, talking together about how we all see this work from our different perspectives. And I think that's one of the benefits of being at a mid-sized institution in terms of the size of our staff, is that we can really have those constructive conversations. So I'm working, you mentioned the show I'm working on, Touching Truth, Crafting Presence. That has me really in a space of an intersection of conceptual art and craft-based practice. So that's an area that I'm working on. In 20 years, I've also found that we kind of collect in waves, and it's determined by what's up ahead of you, right? And so I had the incredible opportunity to reinstall an 8,000 square foot permanent collection gallery. And so for a decade leading up to that, you can say, we're acquiring this incredible 14-foot wide cabinet by Joris Larman because it's going front and center in the installation. Right. But if I go and present a 14-foot cabinet tomorrow, like it's going to storage, or is it, so it doesn't mean that we might not also acquire something large, but I think the projects that we have ahead of us, whether it's a storage renovation, whether it's an installation, whether it's a deaccessioning campaign that's actually going to make space in storage, those are all part of, an additional part of what influences how we're working.
And Alisa, final word to you. As when you presented your collection plan to the committee, to your board, it's an interesting point that Rachel just brought up, and obviously MoMA has over the last few years been deaccessioning work themselves through auctions, most prominently at Sotheby's in a significant sale that netted like $80 million, but primarily in fine art and photographs and things like that. Are you looking at deaccessioning as well as part of your collection plan, or are you just pretty much focusing right now on filling in some gaps that you feel like the previous curators were not focusing on?
A little bit of both, but at least when it comes to the deaccessioning, this is always important in museums, this work, but we do have some legal restrictions on when things can be deaccessioned, at least in the part of the collection that I oversee, and it's about 3,000 objects that I oversee, so it's not terribly overwhelming. And as I mentioned, much of that collection, the strengths have been out on view because we had the gallery space for it. But my focus is really going to be more on adding to the collection, and I was so pleased that there was so much excitement about this new potential direction for us. This museum hasn't had living designers really engaged for a very long time, or have talks by them. So I'm excited to bring them to the museum, and not just have their works in the galleries, but also have commissions for benches, for example, in our galleries, in ways that visitors can interact with their designs. I mentioned, we have this great encyclopedic collection, so I'm really thinking about a kind of globally inclusive narrative, building on the historical strengths of our collection, whether it's our African design, bringing that into the contemporary with, contemporary Afro-diasporic makers. And also I'm really excited about engaging this new younger generation of designers. Just met Joyce Lynn, for example, last night, but that's one of the directions that I'm most excited about, is the new energy and new directions and ways that these younger designers are thinking about the design world and thinking about new technology, thinking about AI, thinking about 3D and digital fabrication processes, but also thinking about the return of the hand. And so actually craft is also an important part of the conversation that we're having at the museum now. And we have so many wonderful curators at our museum, and so I'm excited to collaborate with them to think about displays in our galleries, especially because the silos between art, design, craft seem to be dissolving more and more in the work of these artists. So it'll be very exciting to present that in our galleries. And
well, hopefully you find a real home there in Richmond, and that you too can put down 20 years of experience moving forward. It is actually quite unusual, I think. Many museum curators do move from position to position as they work their way up the curatorial ladder. Many curators that I work with have been at 5 or 6 museums over a 10 to 15 year period. So we'll see what happens for you over the next few years with working with this great new position. We've hit a ton of encyclopedic. We've really covered a lot of ground, but I can't thank you enough for coming. Any questions, real quick, from any of you here?
I don't want to be in between us here and the booths, so I know people want to leave. But I am intrigued. To what degree are you all competing with each other for new acquisitions? Your museums have specific areas of focus, but nonetheless, there are only
I mean, we're often competing with each other for staff. It's like who can hire away the best talent. But in terms of there being an auction and Carnegie and MoMA are bidding against each other, that almost never happens.
That would have been a dream of mine at Sotheby's. That,
Right.
that never happened.
And that's partly because we're often going after different things at the same time. MoMA's got super deep holdings in some areas that we don't need to shop around for, whereas Carnegie's got holes, and vice versa. They've got things that we don't have. So there's no duplicate. There's no collection exactly like Carnegie's out there. There's no collection exactly like MoMA. So we are often kind of after different things at one time.
I mean, that said, and you know, you can't collude, but you also, you know, nobody wants two not-for-profit institutions directly competing, head to head at auction. That said, you know, pivoting to galleries, you know, where we also make a number of acquisitions. You know, people like James are conduits and know if they know us well, if they're doing their job, you know, they know what's on my wish list versus Alisa's wish list versus Paul's wish list, and so they might have an upcoming project. And even though, you know, we all know the show's opening on October 10th, you know, James might nudge me and say, Rachel, so you know, this is coming up. I know you don't want to miss this, right? So sometimes we, you know, gallerists will reach out to us and give us a heads up, but we also miss things. I mean, you get to a show and at a gallery, and there's new work by an artist, and you're drawn, you know, like a moth to a flame. That's the one, and you know, the gallerist says, you know, your colleague got here right before you. So it happens. It happens, but I think we have to be fluid enough. It's very difficult to say, I want this one exact object in the world. And sometimes we try. Sometimes we do, you know, chase those things down for decades. But often you have to win some and you lose some.
But also, and again, when it comes to the contemporary makers that these curators are acquiring, one thing that in the gallery world we did to solve this conundrum was to create the concept of the edition. So, for example, with a Norman Teague stool that you saw in the Philadelphia Museum of Art's photograph, which MoMA owns an example of, when I was at the Gallery R and Company. And you got, of course, oh my God, we have, the three clean sweep in different ways. I forgot about that. But that's the point. At the gallery, we created with Norman Teague an edition of 25 and at a relatively, really affordable price compared to what these masterworks that you see in their collections would go for in the market. And thus creating sort of an accessibility so that many institutions around the country can acquire the same idea, the same object, each one handmade by the artist, slightly differently in many ways, but that's one way to solve that.
And that was the same with the Wendy Murayama chair as well, right? That was an edition of 10 from her original edition of 25. So
Yeah.
I think the example that we acquired in Virginia, there were a few other museums around the United States that also acquired Murayama chairs from that new edition. 7
of them, in fact. And again, that was a situation where you have the living artist who is now in her 70s. She first created that chair in 1981. She made them to order for craft galleries in the 80s, then stopped making them. And then when her work was being rediscovered in the late 2010s, COVID happened, and during lockdown, she made another 10 of them, basically, and said to me at the time, you know, how many of these can we actually add to institutions now? And that's what happened there, which is exciting.
But it's a good question. Thank you.
Anything else? Well, thank you so much for attending.